What's up? This is Dan Fredenberg for FIGGERRIDOUT.com, and today I'm with Fadi Boumitiri, who is an attorney, financier, and commercial real estate investor. Geez, Fadi, can you leave some titles for the rest of us? But thanks for being here today, Fadi. Since this show has a recurring theme of starting from zero in a new focus in your career or a new focus in your business, and no one will work with you from zero if you can't introduce yourself, can you please introduce yourself, Fadi?
Sure. Fadi Boumitiri. I have a law degree, practiced law for about 10 years on my own. As soon as I graduated from law school, hung my own shingle, started my own small law firm, told myself that I was going to do business law and real estate law. And like all other attorneys, took whatever came in the door for a number of years first. That included some business and some real estate law, but it also included stuff I swore I would never do, including criminal law, including bankruptcy law. And believe it or not, what I came to find out was I enjoyed those areas of law as much or more, right? So I actually enjoyed the interactions of the criminal law, rubbing elbows with the prosecutors, with the other defense attorneys, with judges at times. I loved bankruptcy law because it had a very succinct beginning, middle, and an end. And I found that litigation long-term wasn't my thing because it would drag out for years and years, and most of the time nobody ended up happy. And so I kind of started to tailor things out of my practice, and before you knew it, I don't know, several years in, was mostly a business and real estate practice. And then as we went further and further, it became exclusively business and real estate until a few of my clients asked me to become business partners with them on new ventures. And after several years of resisting, I decided I was gonna, take the dive and begin doing what I always said I would do, which was to have multiple businesses and multiple streams of income. And before you knew it, I essentially flipped a switch in 2017 and stopped practicing law for other people and began practicing law for my own businesses and my own ventures, and began being more of a businessman rather than a solo entrepreneur and a solo attorney.
Right. So you're still a licensed attorney, but you actually spend most of your professional time each week talking to investors, right?
Absolutely, yes.
Wow, far up. You may or may not know, I spoke to the Vincent brothers on my show this year, and we already discussed the system in general, so you get off easy on this one. I want to talk about tech as it relates to law, and that'll be a little bit later because we've got to get all our real estate people taken care of because they're most of our viewers here. But I think you're a great guy to work with investors because it's obvious that you couldn't be deceitful if you tried. It's either that or you're just so good at it that you even got past me, but I doubt it. But anyways, for our real estate crowd, though, let's say a couple things about how, like I know that every apartment complex owner these days, they're getting hounded with offers, and that means that they're not getting their price. A huge part of a real estate deal are the terms, so it's possible to make creative offers to either meet the price or better, using these creative means. Now, you told me a structure with above prime return on seller financing yesterday. Can you walk us through that?
Sure. So essentially what I was talking about yesterday is in a situation where you have a seller that's willing to carry back at least some portion of the purchase price, where you do have perhaps traditional lending in place. A financial institution is doing 70 or perhaps 80% of the loan for the purchase price. You could still have your seller become the investor that carries back the remainder of that. And so there's a number of ways to structure that, but I think the most basic one that we discussed was giving that seller a tiny little piece of equity. I mean, in an LLC, it could be as little as 0.01% or less. So giving that seller a small piece of equity and instead having essentially a promissory, right? A promissory note, a promise of repayment to that seller of that amount of money. And the example that I used was a $10 million purchase price, and the bank happens to come in for 75% of the value. So now the 2.5 million that you need to bring to closing, there's two important things here. Number one is the structure of how you come to agreement with that seller, but number two is also that the banks will often require fresh funds be brought to that closing. So you will have to bring 2.5 million in order to give that 2.5 million to the seller. So sometimes that seller has 2.5 million and brings it for you. Sometimes you've got to bring that money from another place, and then eventually that comes back to you through the closing. Mm-hmm. And most of the time, the lenders either are aware of what's going on, or will ask you straightforward to, hey, we don't really, we're not asking you where the money is coming from. We're telling you we must have 2.5 million in cash brought to closing, essentially. So, so that's the second and the easy part. The more difficult part is coming to terms with the seller. You've got to figure out what it is that the seller wants, and essentially that starts off with learning what the seller is used to, right? What is the seller making from the building currently? Why are they selling the building? Is it because they're sick of management, or is it because they want a lump sum of money? If it's because they want a lump sum of money and they still have a mortgage on the property, you may have a more difficult time coming to terms with that seller. But if they have it free and clear, you may be able to still come to terms with them, because they're getting 75% of their money from a financial institution or a lender. And then that remaining 25% of the money, they may be willing to keep into the deal. Why? Maybe they're only making 2, 3, 5, 10% on their money with the full, people think that real estate is passive. Real estate is only passive if you're a limited partner, right? An investor. For the operators, it's a full-time active job. And it's very possible that this seller is very motivated to sell because they don't want to be actively working that property any longer. And so you give them the option to go from the 5 to 10% that they were making actively working it, to all of a sudden making 5% as a limited partner sitting at home doing nothing. A lot of people will jump on that. Not everybody comes from the the single family and multifamily flipping world where 10% is the standard, right? A lot of people look at 5% and they say, we haven't seen 5% from a bank basically ever. We haven't even seen 1% from a bank in the last decade. So some people will look at that and say, I'm going to make 5 times my money having it sit with you rather than sitting in a bank. And they would prefer to do that, because now that's at least some consistent income for them from that $2.5 million.
Right. And let's get into something edgy before we move on to the next question, because it applies so closely to it. So I'm just, one thing I like to do whenever I'm doing tech or any kind of deal or anything like that, mostly to make sure that my ethics are clean, but also to just make sure I'm putting myself in the other person's shoes. As an investor, when I hear something like that, it's like, okay, yeah, it sounds fantastic. The biggest thing that I took away, which is why I wanted to include it in here as a question, was because the way that you phrased it was something along the lines is like, okay, we're closing. Here's your part of the money. Like Tim was saying, it's like, so what are you going to do with it? And they're like, I don't know. It's like, okay, well.
So I was telling the story yesterday about Tim, my business partner, going to the closing table early on in his multifamily career. One of the first multifamily buildings that he purchased, if I'm not mistaken. He got to the closing table, and back then you actually went in and closed in person with the buyer and the seller. And so he's sitting across the table from the seller, and the seller's going to make, I don't remember how much, but let's say it was $1 million between the bank financing and the down payment and everything else. And so Tim, being the wise guy that he is, goes, "Hey, money bags, what are you going to do with all that money now?" And the seller kind of looked a little bit distraught and said, I don't really know what I'm going to do with it. And Tim, kind of being Tim, immediately was like, well, why don't you lend it back to me? We can do a couple of other deals together. I'll use your money, and we can, I'll find the deals. I'll flip them, I'll manage them, all that different stuff. And the guy said yes, and became an investor, and stayed an investor for at minimum 5 years that I know of. I think it's still running, if I'm not mistaken. So it's funny. Sometimes the first lesson here is, you never try. If you never try, you never know, right? If you don't bother to ask, then you don't know if this person really does want to have a return on their investment.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. So where I was going with that line of questions, though, it's gets dark really, really quick, and we can get rid of it if it's iffy. It's one of the things that's coming to my mind that would concern me in any kind of investment, especially when you're saying, okay, you're going to get this part of the money here, and you're getting this in advance because of this and all that kind of stuff. See, like I had the unfortunate circumstance of having an accountant that I couldn't communicate with. There was a language barrier there. And so I ended up having to learn all this stuff for myself. And so, I know that all business is a little bit, it's like, okay, well, the name, the picture on all the $100 bills, it's the same picture. So you can't really tell. It's like, oh, this is like from rental revenue. This is from refinance or whatever that, and this is it over there. And it's like, okay, you give me a big chunk of money and then you get a smaller chunk of money and I just keep on paying that and all that kind of stuff. That's how a lot of the illegitimate types of investments end up coming out. Are there any ways to help people feel better about investing? Like they're saying, like, okay, like this is too good to be true, all that kind of stuff. What can you say that actually seems to work as far as when somebody says this is too good to be true?
So first of all, what can you say is a very loaded question. It depends on so many different things, including whether you're registered as a security, whether you're registered as an exemption from securities, whether you are registered under one exemption versus another. With a 506c exemption, you are able to generally solicit, so you can throw it out there on Facebook to your thousands of followers and just say, hey, I'm looking to raise money on this deal and here are the specifics of the deal. Right. Whereas if you're doing basically any other type of exemption from registration of security, you're not allowed to do that. What you instead have to do is have a conversation with people that you already have a substantial relationship with, and discuss it with them. And I'm not going to say it has to be a one-on-one discussion. It could be a 1-on-3, 1-on-5 discussion, but you certainly don't want to be doing a 1-on-20 discussion, because what are the odds that not a single person in that group of 20 isn't already a substantial relationship of yours, right? So essentially what I would say, what you can and cannot say depends on your audience and your registration or lack of registration. And then from there, essentially, what can you say? Here's what I will tell you not to say. Don't say anything that's not truthful, for sure. Make sure that you're disclosing everything that you would want to know if you were the investor. That's the easiest way. If you want to stay out of trouble with the SEC, or even just with an average person, tell them everything you know about a property. Tell them everything you would want to know about a property. And guess what? They're not going to be able to say, hey, you didn't tell me that, especially if you're putting it into a private placement memorandum. You've got a multi-page document that discloses all of this stuff again, and they're signing off on that document. Then you could just point to that document and say, I certainly did tell you. Here it is on page 6 or page 66, whatever it is, right? So make sure that you are disclosing everything. I like to use the word material or substantial. Anything of material value or substantial value needs to be disclosed. Anything that would potentially change their mind or make them question whether or not to invest with you needs to be disclosed. From there, should you be telling them, hey, double-digit returns? Again, most of the time the answer is absolutely not, because you're enticing that investor. If you have a 506c investment where you're allowed to generally solicit, at that point you may be able to just say, hey, double-digit returns. Some SEC attorneys will tell you they still don't like doing that, and others will tell you, with the registration of the exemption and the ability to generally solicit, you're all right doing that. So you really have to figure out what your appetite for risk is, and you have to find an SEC attorney that, number one, is aligned with your appetite for risk, and number two, is available to ask questions of, so that you're not just kind of guessing as to whether he would be okay with what you're saying or not.
Right. What we had to do with the coaching side of the bank that I used to work for, we had to get people doing pay-per-click, and so we're talking, like $40 plus per click to go to a coaching application, and that was actually to establish that prior existing relationship. And the other thing that I found was a pattern in the questions. were that it's finding your appetite for risk, in the sense of like you have to have some sort of sense of that person's financial situation, which you don't until you actually ask. But when I'm talking about allaying people's fears that there's something funny going on, I'm talking about when you're already sitting at the person's kitchen table, that prior existing relationship is already there. And I understand if you know, like there's only like 2 or 3 tricks out there to make somebody feel better, and you know, you kind of need to keep that in your pocket. But
no, there's no trick to it. I would argue that there is no trick to it. There's, as Tim as Tim likes to say, there's 2 very important things that you need to have as you're sitting there at that table. Number 1 is trust. They have to trust you. They have to know that you're the kind of person that'll do the right thing under tough circumstances. They have to trust that you're the kind of person that won't take their money and just immediately abscond with it. They have to trust that you're taking their money and actually putting it into what you're saying you're going to put it into. They have to trust that you're putting it into a project and that you've disclosed all the potential issues with that project. So trust is extremely important there. And number 2 is respect. And respect is very different, but still just as important. What does respect mean? Well, they have to look at you and they have to think, do I think they're capable of doing what they're saying they're going to do, right? Do I think that Fadi Boumitiri is capable of investing my money in an apartment building and giving me a 10% return? And do I think he's capable of finding a property that is, you know, below average rent and can be bumped up? Do I think he's capable of taking that property and flipping the units and making the exterior look nicer? Do I think he's capable of all of those different things? If yes, then I have respect for his ability to do those things. When you add that into the trust that I have from knowing him for so many years and knowing that he's a man of his word, those 2 things combine to allow that person to hear you out and listen to whether this is a good opportunity for them or not. And then from there, the things that you want to emphasize more than anything, number 1, every single investor cares more about protecting their initial investment than they do about the returns that they're potentially going to get from that investment. So how do you protect them? Run down the list. Make sure you know how you protect them. Make sure you are protecting them. Make sure you're differentiating yourselves from anybody else and how you're protecting them, and go above and beyond. Give them examples. I love when investors ask me, can you give me an example of a time where things didn't go the way you thought they would? And I love that, because guess what? Things don't go the way you think. Yeah, I mean, realistically, there are 2 very specific ones that I use every single time. And those ones, when I get to the end of them and investors are like, well, that doesn't sound so bad. Of course it doesn't sound bad. Why? Because we're going to take care of our investors. As I told you just before this, here's the list of things that we do to make sure that our investors are taken care of. So of course, you know, we don't have a single situation that I could ever remember where an investor was not taken care of, period. And I hope that I will die saying exactly those same words, because to me, I started off on the investor side with my business partner. I didn't start off as a general partner. I was the guy lending him money, and then I was the guy having family members of mine lending him money. And, you know, I'll take risks with my own money, but when it comes to other people's money, I get a little bit more gun shy, right? So I'm willing to take a high risk on an option contract or a high risk on a cannabis company with my money. But you know how many other people's money I've put into anything like that? Zero.
Right.
$0, not even of my own family's money that have asked me to be involved in those things. And I'll flat out tell them no. Right. What I believe in is protecting that money. And when I'm taking a risk, and I know it's a risk, I'm not interested in having other people come along for the ride. Even if they understand those risks, it's just easier for me to sleep at night knowing that it's my money at risk, and I can always go out and make more if I lose it all.
That dovetails into the next question perfectly, because it's all about trust and the relationship with the investor. And I still don't want to move on to my weird stuff yet. I want to stick with real estate. So right now, where there's just been an eviction moratorium announced, and I heard that you were saying that investors are putting people under shorter rental contracts to deal with it. But you said that those contracts will count as vacancies to investors, so you can't really invest in those. That's right?
So essentially the way that it works is some people have come up with pretty interesting ways to make sure that they can still evict during all of this, right? One of the smartest things that I've heard is, well, you can evict for anything except non-payment. When a contract ends, you give a 30-day notice in the state of Ohio, for instance, and then you can evict them, right? Because there's no contract. They have no legal right to be there. It's not because they didn't pay. It's because their legal right to be there no longer exists. So you can still evict them for that purpose. And I know I've spoken with people who have decided that the smart thing for them to do is not renew people, keep them on a month-to-month tenancy, and just, you know, ride it out. Well, the issue with that for people who have just recently purchased that building and are looking to refinance it in a short time period, or people who have owned it for a long time and are looking to refinance in a relatively short time period, the issue with it is those don't count as net operating income for the potential lender. They're going to look at that as a vacancy. Why? Because that person could leave tomorrow. And most likely you want them to leave tomorrow. So it does, in their minds, in the mind of that lender, it does count as a vacancy. It is not a secured long-term tenant. And even though you have a 12-month contract that's about to end in 1 month, and you have a month-to-month tenancy that's about to end in 1 month, they're not treated the same. That 12-month contract that's about to end in a month is treated as part of the net operating income of the property, and therefore does get evaluated as part of the lender's decision on how much they're willing to lend you. That month-to-month tenancy will not generally count.
Okay, so for the net operating income, it's basically the equivalent of finding a duffel bag with money in it, you know, on your property or something like that. It's not.
Yeah,
it's not
we can't say that this is a repeatable kind of thing. So we're not going to assume that for the next 5 years or 10 years of this loan that it's going to be repeated. Exactly right.
Awesome, awesome. Well, you're really sharp, Fadi, and as a result, you're the first. Well, and also I think your tolerance for weirdness is a little bit beyond what a lot of my other guests have been. So you're the first one that I'm actually going to explain my real inspiration from my body of work. So this show overtly is about using attention to detail to learn a new skill when you don't know anyone and you have no money. And so to satisfy that part, you know, and keep with real estate for a second here, can you tell that story about why you did so well in contract law in school?
So I was telling Dan that in law school, everybody really just hated contract law. You know, it's not something that's easy to explain. It's mostly logic, and it's something that you have to either get or not get. And for many reasons, I always got contracts. I always understood it. I understood the logic behind it. I understood how it worked. And my study group was just bewildered of how, without really reading and without really studying, I knew these things and they didn't, even though they studied a lot more. And the answer to that is because I kind of grew up with contracts, right? So I'll give you an even more in-depth story than you're asking for. But once upon a time when I was maybe, let's say, 15 years old, my parents were kind of stewing over a business deal, and they were trying to figure something out. And my uncle, who's a very sharp person, I actually attribute a lot of my attention to detail to my uncle. My family was very close. We lived with my grandparents and with my uncle. And my uncle, you know, hey, let me see the contract. Let me review this. And he's reviewing it, and he's just kind of scratching his head. My other uncle, who's also an engineer and reviews a lot of contracts in the engineering world, is reviewing it, and they're all trying to figure out this problem. And the problem is that that essentially my parents thought they had a right to purchase a piece of the property that they were operating off of, and the sellers were saying, we're not selling it to you, period. And so my parents are like, I swear our attorney told us that we have a right to buy this thing, but the attorney's passed away. And by the way, that attorney was never really a great person in the first place. That's a whole different story.
Yeah.
But so my parents are stewing over this, and I'm hearing them talking for hours about this whole thing and try to figure out, should we just file a lawsuit. We don't have any basis for a lawsuit. We don't like lawsuits. You know, this is a foreign couple that has only been in the United States at that point probably less than 10 years, have only been citizens for less than 10 years, really don't understand the legal system at all. So my uncle's like, just file a lawsuit. And my other uncle's like, well, on what basis? And so I'm like, give me the contract. And I review the contract and I'm like, it's right here. You guys have the right to buy it for $120,000. And they're like, well, they said they'll sell it to us for $250,000. And I'm like, well, you have the right here to buy it for $120,000.
Yeah.
And they're like, okay, so what do we do? And I'm like, well, you tell them that you're going to buy it right now for $120,000. And if they say no, you sue them.
Yeah.
Well, we don't know what a lawsuit is, blah, blah, blah. So it began negotiations and the two sides went back and forth. And the lowest they could get the other side to come down to was 150. And my parents were about to do it. And I'm like, no, don't do it. They're like, well, our attorney is advising us to do it. And I said, no, don't do it.
Yeah.
Don't do it. I'm like, what are you going to pay an attorney to get this done? 5,000, 10,000, 15,000. You're giving them an additional 15 on top of that. Plus you're giving them that 15 instead of giving it to the attorney.
Right.
And so my parents went back and said, no, we're buying this for 120 or it's a lawsuit.
Yeah.
And so eventually they came down to, I want to say it was 125 or 130. And my parents go, all right, fine, business decision. It's going to cost us more to get to the finish line with an attorney. Let's just get it done. And so true story, I saved them probably 50% of the purchase price of that property. And we still own that property to this day.
Awesome. I hope they got you like a new, what year was that? PlayStation and Nintendo 64?
They've given me a lot more than I deserve in this life, so I'm not worried about it.
There you go. There's that sensibility that you don't really get often enough out here. But that's really fantastic. I really enjoy that story because it really is something that people forget so easily about. Like if it's not your first language, if it's not your culture, getting through this system is extremely difficult.
Even if it is your first language, I know so many people that have contacted me and they look at a contract and they're like, I have no idea what this says. And I've always been able to look at it and say, well, here it says this and here it says that. And, based on those two things, and you put a little bit of logic behind it. And generally, the court system in, let's say 80%, maybe even 90% of the time, case law is going to follow logic and statutory law is going to follow logic. Every once in a while, the logic just goes out the window and they make some kind of exception that doesn't really make sense, or they make some kind of law that doesn't make sense. But generally, you can figure out what's going to happen based on logic. And even more importantly than that, while negotiating, unless you are sitting across the table from somebody that really knows the case law and knows those weird exceptions, they're probably going to be basing their decision on logic as well. And at that point, it gives you the ability to come to the table with a little bit more confidence, just knowing, hey, I reviewed the contract, I know what it says, and there's a little bit of logic behind what would happen based on what it says.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. So that really did go into the heart of what I want to go into, which is the system in general, right? I had to do all that stuff, and yeah, I know that it's all in English, but English is my wife's third language, and she's just learning. She's basically conversational in her fourth now, so that's really cool since being back here. But it really is such a hassle, and I really like that legal idea of.
Is French her fourth? Sorry.
Her fourth language, yeah. Her fourth is French, yeah, that's right, yeah. It's, me, I always tell people I speak 3 languages because I speak English and Mandarin, but I'm a third of the way of where I need to be in 3 other languages. So that's basically how it is. But I can start a fight in 10, no problem. So there you go. But basically, I want to talk about the system, but that I'm now in commercial real estate from tech, and I because we're talking about the system, I want to make sure that I couldn't label any of the steps as white male privilege. Okay. And now, of course, I lived in Taiwan for 15 years. So I was the minority. I was 1 or 2% tops of Taipei is white. And So I want to talk to you about if it exists, not the least because you have an ambiguous appearance and no tinge of other languages in your accent or your expressions. So, I mean, I know the truth, but if I didn't know your name and you didn't actually tell me, I'd look at you and there's a huge range of error the way that I look at it. Okay, it's like, so maybe this, maybe this, maybe this. Basically, the entire Mediterranean would be possible. But I'm guessing most people look at you and think, white, I guess, something like that. Now, all of that was just to say that I know that you check all the boxes to hypocritically talk about this subject. And I'm setting up this question so that you don't have to reveal it if you don't want to. You can go ahead if you want to. But if you remember, though, as well, I told you that when we met, I was shocked because I thought people at your company were calling the in-house attorney a nickname for being overweight, right? I was shocked. I'm like, how is that okay that they're calling him fatty? It's just like, how is that all right? But with that preamble of saying, so we covered the white male privilege, we covered the male part, but let's talk about genders for a second. But we're not going to get anything too nasty. So from a legal standpoint, how do genders differ? Like, are laws applied, like, I guess specifically in business, are they applied differently to one gender from another? Like, are there rules based on what gender the person who's running the business is?
I would say that there's not allowed to be any differentiation. The only differentiation that I can see is that there are some programs that try to kind of narrow the gap between I'll call it the white male privilege versus females or minorities.
Mm-hmm.
So there are, for instance, contracts that are given preference to female-owned businesses or to minority-owned businesses, things of that sort.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, there are going to be people out there in the business world who prefer to deal with a white male that doesn't have a weird name and that doesn't have an accent or whatever it is, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's certainly going to be those people, but I will be honest with you and tell you that in the business world, I see that a lot less than I do in the outside of business world. To me, what I've found is that most business people are generally just, I want to get my hours in so that I can go home with money and do the things that I want to do, right? If that means 1 hour, that's great. If that means 10 hours a day, it's unfortunate, but I do what I got to do. That's not to say there are no racist, sexist, bigoted business people, but generally what I find is with business people more than any other group, it's more so about one color, and that's green.
Right, yeah. And this is something that I had to deal with head on because basically, the reason why race is even in the picture is because I spent 15 years in Taiwan watching them reverse engineer or hack, whatever you want to call, Western economy and society. And I don't mean that in a bad way. It's just they want to do business with Americans, and so they have to learn what's it like doing business in America. And so I ended up parsing out those different things. It's like, okay, how will one person get treated differently from somebody else? Like one thing that Asians have a disadvantage with in the Western job market, maybe post-COVID it'll be different, but one is that they don't shake hands. They'll do it, excitedly. It's like, wow, this is neat. I get to shake my hands. I get to shake hands with somebody, but they don't usually do that with each other. And one of the things is because of the patriarchy being so much more ingrained in Chinese culture, where the boss is here and the employee is here, regardless of gender. It really is a situation in an interview, for example, where they'll just be totally quiet. They'll just sit there and, and that's it. That won't fly in the West. They want to know, oh, hey, how you doing? All right, good. Oh, I'm really glad to be here. It's great weather we've been having, huh? Just be a little bit friendly and all that kind of stuff. And I was going like, why is that? And in my head, and I'm probably going to edit out this whole chunk, but in my head, I've always been thinking about how the one thought going through most people's minds at work is, I don't want to be here. I don't want to be doing this stuff. I'm interviewing somebody just so that it's a little bit better, a little bit easier for me. And so my only real question in my mind is, are you going to make my job more difficult or less difficult? I think that's the only thing that's going through their head, but there are loads of ways that it could be misconstrued for, okay, no, I'm just going to pick a white male, you know, and so if I part those out too, you know, like why white? Well, it's because, you know, who knows what kind of jokes are inappropriate for that particular culture. And then with women, you know exactly which kinds of jokes are inappropriate. But if somebody likes to make jokes about their phallus, then, you know, what can you do? And I think it's an unfortunate truth, but I don't think it's as nefarious as it might be put out there. And I think white men like me just have to realize it's like, okay, well, figure out what's actually a priority for you, and find those qualities in whoever is interviewed, rather than just, you know, wholesale saying, oh, you're like this, so, you know, I don't want to work with you.
I'll tell you this, as somebody who's hired probably in the neighborhood of 40, 50 people in my time.
Mm-hmm.
It is very difficult to have conversations with employees and they start to go a certain way, and you're like, I'm comfortable with the conversation. I'm uncomfortable with the potential legality behind the conversation, right? So they start talking about, you know, politics. In our current time, we start talking about politics or religion, and you know, one side gets uncomfortable, you have to make sure you shut it down, right? If both sides are engaging back and forth, you might still have to shut it down. Why? Because at some point something might get said that does make one side uncomfortable, and realistically, is it worth the headache? And this is one of the hardest things for employers right now, because taking a normal everyday situation and turning it into a legal situation has gotten a lot easier to do, which is a lot harder on the employer, right? All you have to do is, you know, pick up a camera or record a conversation, and, you know, have it talking about anything on earth, and it could have been a totally fine conversation, something you've talked about with that person 100 times, but this time they have a nefarious reason for recording you with it, and it changes things, right? So my rule inside of my workspaces is, listen, you can have conversations about almost anything, but as soon as anybody's uncomfortable, we have a safe word, right? Like, just, hey, everybody's going to shut down the conversation immediately if we say the word, and pineapple is the word, right?
Okay.
Only because it's been used in multiple movies in the past, and it's like, hey, if your manager walks in and says, no guys, pineapples, you shut down the conversation. If one of the people in the conversation is like, hey, pineapples, man, I don't want to go there.
Yeah.
Shut down the conversation. So
yeah, that's great. That's a great policy. I like that. Yeah, that's really awesome. Of course, I remember back where I grew up, it'd be, dude. Right? But what can you do?
The problem with dude is sometimes the reaction is what? And then they go even further, right? Whereas with pineapples, you can't really work pineapples into a conversation without going, why did you use the word pineapples? And so it works, right? So they're like, oh, all right, well, if I don't want to get in, and our rule is, if I say pineapples once, we're good. If I have to say pineapples twice, you're kind of in trouble. And if I ever have to say it 3 times, you're terminated. Period.
3 pineapples, you're out. Let that be a lesson to everybody.
Yeah.
That's great.
This is not Fruit Ninja, guys. 3 pineapples, you are out.
That's funny. All right, so we were talking about the gender part of legal, and just so that I've completely covered that, there are 3 types of corporations in America, right? LLCs, C corps, and S corps, and all of them are technically genderless as well, right?
So first of all, there's a lot more than that, but those are the 3 most common. There are also limited partnerships. There are just standard partnerships. There's sole proprietorships. Right. But every single one of those are going to be gender neutral. Absolutely.
All right. So legally, we've covered all people with all genders and genderless as well, I suppose. So enough of this serious talk. But I've got some bad news for you. It's part of the surprise. A friend of ours is joining us, and you missed his unbirthday. You want to meet him? Yeah. Before we do, what's the legal definition of dead?
Ooh, that's a good question.
To your recollection,
probably no longer, heart no longer beating and blood no longer circulating, I would guess.
Something like that. Okay. Did you hear that I've become immortal?
I did not.
Yeah, I can speak from beyond the grave, and I'll be 40 years old, just like this, indefinitely. I was thinking about what that would mean for a writer or a public figure or a corporation. And this is bleeding edge technology here. I have, it's a digital avatar, and I can beam my avatar around the world with just an email. Okay, as far as like from my knowledge of the legal system, copyright is out the freaking window here. So it's a digital avatar. I'll show you in a second. That's part of the surprise. But what medium do you think it would be tried under if you have a digital avatar that can look like you, sound like you? It's like it. This is about to get really, really scary, really, really fast.
I am looking forward to it. When it's spoken that quickly, I have 20 to maybe 50% retention. On that one, it was definitely closer to 20.
20. There you go. Well, that's right. But the thing that's amazing is that the computer very clearly knew where the emphasis in the sentences should be, like what's a question, what's a statement, all that kind of stuff. And like, I mean, like the computer sells it completely as far as I'm concerned. You know, it's like, it looks like I know what I'm talking about.
Oh, it always looks like you know what you're talking about.
All right, yeah, I walked right straight into that, but there you go. But anyway, there's the 1 minute clip, and but let's talk about the avatar first as it relates to freedom of speech. To my recollection, the limits on speech are slander, defamation, libel, and hate speech.
Okay.
So like, is that accurate? You think I've missed many?
I think that's off the top of my head, everything that I would say you're,
right.
Or infringement, right? Infringement upon the rights of others. I think, I don't know how you would do that through speech, but yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Cool. Yeah. Well, that comes in. I had another deep fake AI do some Eminem lyrics from Without Me. You know, it's you know, such a disaster, such a catastrophe. So you see the damage on my ass, you ask for me. That's that kind of thing. And it was pretty wild. And I know that it's like, okay, yeah, that's not great. But let's go through them all in this context. So first of all, what is slander?
Slander is essentially speaking something that's false about somebody else.
Okay. And
it has to be false for sure, and then I believe it has to have some kind of damages behind it for it to be actionable.
Okay. And can my digital avatar slander people or?
I would say yeah, it could.
Yeah, I think it could too. What's defamation?
Essentially, largely the same thing, but usually defamation is going to include some kind of like a character. So you're attacking the character of somebody. You're saying that they did something or that they are something that they are not.
Right. And libel is it is when it's non-factual,
essentially.
Right, but it's broadcast or printed, right?
Yes.
Okay, so if my digital avatar said that you always wear pink underpants, it'd probably be libel, right?
You're gonna put me in a chicken or the egg situation, an impossible question, huh?
Well, you know, I guess the question then is like, if you were going to try and defend me, you'd figure that libel, because libel has the least teeth, I'd say, right? You know, like, you know, libel, you can just make a retractor, and you're pretty much good, right? There's not really much they can do about that with libel.
I don't know that just the retractor is enough, but yeah, I mean, at least you can make a retractor. I would say that slander has the least teeth because usually it's a he said, she said, but in this case, it's not, right? So
unless I take it down.
As long as
that's the thing, you know, like that's why I have days worth of footage talking about my character and my ethics, right? It's because, like, all right, well, here's a conundrum, right? But I guess the last one to cover under there is hate speech, and hate speech is usually not codified for the same reason why porn's not codified, right?
We know it when we see it. That's the answer that I believe the Supreme Court gave.
Yeah, that's reassuring. Yeah, exactly. Now I made one mistake in this show already, which is like basically that was one of the things about calling it Figure It Out. It's for anybody who actually does take the insane amount of time to watch a big chunk of the stuff I have. Part of it is saying, like, I can make days worth of footage without messing up legally and getting myself canceled, even when I'm talking about, the most controversial things. Like, what does it mean to be left? What does it mean to be right? And not be nasty about it, right? Very difficult line to walk on, right? But the mistake I made is I did reveal in one episode that I'm aware of what plausible deniability means. Right? If I didn't actually record me proving that, then it would leave me in a much better situation as far as I'm concerned, even though it does have to be a legal defense that can be kept as far as I'm concerned. But to make that, like I told you, this is getting scary. Now catch this. I can actually record someone's voice and my AI will match my expressions with that voice. Okay. Wow. I also have a 2-minute clip of me telling a story in Mandarin, and I can tell where the voice is from, but basically as a digital security guy, like I know that you can't trust that I wrote anything that comes out of my AI's mouth under any circumstances whatsoever. Legally, what can you say on the topic of being on a podcast or something and the person editing it in ways that make you look bad? What kind of legal recourse do you even have if somebody pulls that crap?
So believe it or not, that depends. There are contracts that you can sign in advance that say you have absolutely no legal right to any of that. Mm-hmm. And then if there is no such contract, I'm not 100% sure. I can tell you that Tim is actually very good friends with an attorney that does a lot of this type of law, specifically, removing things from the internet that could be libel or defamation, or it could just be, hey, this is something that is personal and it's true, but you have no right to be posting it. I'm not a public figure, I'm a private entity, and you have no right to be posting this, and I want you to take it down type of stuff. So I bet you'd be the person to talk to about all this.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, it's like one of the things that I know from a technical standpoint that you can do. It's called a black hat search engine optimization. And what it basically means is you flood the internet with your narrative so that people can't find the other stuff. So like ethically, you can see why that's really, really not good. And I'm not saying the way to do it, but I'm saying it can be done. And that's one of the things that I had, I was an extremely private guy. I called Equifax 3 years ago, gave them all my information, all that kind of stuff. They didn't know who I was because of I spent so much time in Taiwan, right? So this is something that I'm acutely aware of how somebody could just plop down, put down a bunch of content. I'm a very private guy, and I didn't want to get this big public persona, all this stuff on social media and all that kind of stuff. I was concerned of trolls, okay? And I ended up using that knowledge about the black hat way to get stuff off the internet, and I was going like, well, if somebody turns around and wants to say bad stuff about me, and I also have videos of Gilbert Gottfried saying bad things about me that I actually wrote what he was saying, it's like, well, everybody's going to see him and nobody's going to see you. Thanks for being here today, Fadi. If you want to get in touch with us about a building, there's a link in the description.